Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, and welcome to our special AIIA University of Tasmania and Indian treatment of trust, ambiguity and the new security outlook, looking from Indian, Southeast Asian and Australian perspectives on AUKUS and the Quad. This event is presented by AIIA, Australian Institute of International Affairs, and I'm Kim Boyer, its State President, the University of Tasmania's Politics and International Relations Program, and the Global Dialogue Forum from India. Welcome to those attending in person, welcome to those attending online, and particular welcomes to those attending from India. It's great to have you with us. Firstly, as a reflection of both the universities and the AIIA's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, I recognise the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting in person, the Palawa people, and pay respect to their elders past and present. I also pay respect to the elders of those areas in the rest of Australia where we have people zooming into our meeting. This land and this culture always was, always will be, and this land has never been ceded. Today, we're going to join our panel in asking the following questions. How does India balance its commitment to the Quad with its imperatives of continental defence and its commitment to the Quad in its relationships with China and Russia? From the Asian perspective, given that ASEAN sits between China, Australia and India, what likely effect will the wariness of its key Southeast Asian nation partners have on regional perspectives and the conduct of relationships? What key issues should the new Australian Labor government grapple with from an Australian perspective in reconciling its minilateral priorities with those of formal US alliances and engagement with the rest of Southeast Asia and its neighbours and the Pacific as well? Firstly, I'd like to actually talk about the background to this. Essentially, the advent of minilateral groupings, such as the tripartite AUKUS arrangement and the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad, attest to the complexity of the context for a free and open Indo-Pacific. So our questions and our speakers will talk around this. So let me introduce our speakers. Firstly, from India, it's great to have Moses Mohanaran from Global Dialogue Forum. Moses is the chairman of the not-for-profit think tank, GDF, and the chairman, editor-in-chief of the associated quarterly journal, Global Dialogue Review. It's a great journal. I recommend that to you. Basically, he's a Singaporean-born Indian national. He held international reporting and senior editorial roles with Reuters News Agency, including as regional head of Reuters Television. Professor James Chin, on my left, from the University of Tasmania, is Professor of Asian Studies and an expert on the politics of Southeast Asia, providing an overview of Southeast Asia and ASEAN perspectives. Dr. Jeff Harriott, on my right, is a former ABC correspondent in India and others, and a latter-day PhD student in international relations. He's a very keen student on the Australian perspective of minilaterals. Each panellist will speak and then raise issues with each other before we move into Q&A, both in the room and also online. My colleague Jeff is handling the questions online, and we'll try to get to as many as we can, but we mightn't be able to manage them all. So first of all, over to Moses. Oops.
Or not.
Or not.
Are these other screens able to show him? No.
It's all the same connectivity.
So sorry, Moses. Are you able to hear us? They say the host has stopped the video. It says to me. I'm trying to put it on the video.
Would you please try again?
Okay, now it's good.
Hey,
Thank you.
lovely to have you. You missed your introduction, but it's great to have you with us.
No, I heard it. Yeah.
So can we pass over to you to do your introduction from the Indian perspective?
Thank you.
Of,
Yeah, yeah.
of-
Thank you. I'm sorry about the background. I'm sorry we had to do it from home because of the, this is where we were connected. Anyway, I hope everyone can hear me. So greetings to everyone from New Delhi, especially Ms. Kim Boyer, President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Tasmanian branch, and our moderator for today, Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies, University of Tasmania, Dr. Jeff Harriott of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and Director, Harriott Media and Governance, Mr. Greg Marshall, Manager Engagement and Partnerships, and Mr. Nigel Chiguida, who got all this working. Of course, I acknowledge with gratitude the organizers, the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and my colleagues led by Ms. Nisha Ramdas in Global Dialogue Forum. The focus of this webinar, as well as its topicality and relevance, will hopefully trigger a healthy debate. The areas concerning us in the webinar are the Indo-Pacific Strategy construct and its offshoots, the Quadrilateral Dialogue, AUKUS, and ASEAN. I'll present India's perception of these issues from an informed but personal view against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine and tensions over Taiwan. There's an ebb and flow in geopolitics, and this is especially the case with empire building and global dominance. So also with the post-war rules-based world order that currently struggles with multipolarity. The rules upholding free passage in the South China Seas became the immediate cause to construct an Indo-Pacific strategy that addresses the shift of global power from the transatlantic to the Pacific and Indian Oceans, where economic and military power is centered outside of the US. The Indo-Pacific strategy is maritime in nature, as its very name suggests. It is spearheaded by Washington with significant support from countries around the two oceans. It replaces the Asia-Pacific and pivot to Asia concepts promoted by earlier presidents of the US, signifying the ebb and flow of the then prevailing power plays. The Quadrilateral Initiative of Quad that was set up to drive the Indo-Pacific strategy is a revival of a proposal by Japan in 2007 and comprises Japan, Australia, the US, and India. It reveals a wide disparity in naval might between the two sets of the Quad's constituents. Even more difficult to assess is AUKUS, a strategy that will be fully rolled out over 2 decades, I believe, and several years longer than it took Alexander the Great to conquer the known world of his time. It is a trilateral security pact involving Australia, the UK, and the US, announced in 2021 for the Indo-Pacific region. The contentious aspect of this pact is the US and UK helping Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines. It raises fears of a weakening of the NPT regime that seeks to prevent nuclear proliferation, with perhaps not that great success anyway. The Indo-Pacific concept was embraced by India at an advantageous time in the tides of the geopolitical cycle. India's support comes from the need to add muscle to its already strong military and economic positions against threats on its two borders. The warming of India's US relations itself flow from the policies of the current BJP-led government, but the movement was initiated by the earlier UPA administration and reflective of the geopolitical mood of the times. It is useful to remember the ebbing of the tide in earlier decades when India was closer to the former Soviet Union and depended on it for weapons purchases in the Cold War days. Historically, it may be also traced to a view on US leanings to Pakistan. This view was cemented during the Bangladesh War of 1971 when the US sent its 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal, backed by an aircraft carrier from the UK, in moves seen as being in support of Pakistan. Now the geopolitical alignments have come full cycle. This should not be put down to realpolitik or the pursuit of geopolitical goals bereft of a moral vision. Rather, national interests may be a better description, as democratically elected governments such as India's need to meet the expectations of the people who voted for them. The West has questioned India's ambivalence over Ukraine in preferring to abstain in UN resolutions against Russia. The abstentions, in fact, probably reflect the views of India and most of the global South, and driven by legitimate national interest aimed at easing the sufferings of millions living through high food prices and unemployment due to the ravages of COVID and now the economic effects of the war in Ukraine. It greatly affects a massive number of people who may in numbers be nearly twice the population of the entire nation of Australia. The very countries of Europe that have over past centuries enslaved and plundered nations, especially of Asia and Africa, are now lecturing India on morality over Ukraine. It is not, as the West presents to the world, opportunism that has persuaded India to buy Russian oil, as India's External Affairs Minister, Mr. S. Jaishankar, has deftly pointed out. It is in India's national interest. National interest also dictates India's approach to other nations and alliances, but it's an approach that is graduated and nuanced. India enjoys robust bilateral trade relations with China, but are rival military and economic powers. For India, therefore, the Quad, with its stated aim of shared vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific and a rules-based maritime order, is a useful strategic tool. It is obviously aimed at containing China on the global maritime theater, which US now dominates and the UK once ruled. The strategy's limitations are also clear to India. India's immediate concerns are land-based, not on the high seas, though its navy is among the world's largest. It is clear and present military threats are on its Himalayan borders. Any maritime alliance is a notional threat against its perennial foes. India has also learned valuable lessons from the Ukraine conflict. First, that it must depend on its own military strengths to fight the enemy and not on cheerleaders on the sidelines. India has also learned as one of the largest standing armies in the world. And the second lesson from Ukraine is that land forces, soldiers, tanks, artillery are crucial to gaining territory, not drones and hypersonic missiles. Besides, this economic strength is another essential asset. The leading countries of Europe and Japan have been embarrassingly exposed for their reliance on other countries for energy supplies and even food. It must be noted here that large countries have greater national resources and larger markets made up of huge populations. The three largest single country domestic markets are the US, China, and India, and they have drawn on their own resources to a large extent to withstand the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine. India, in fact, exports rice to China and wheat to the rest of the world. Though energy deficient, India decided to defy the Western-led imposition of sanctions against Russia over Ukraine because Moscow offered significantly lower prices for its oil, and it is expanding their bilateral economic engagement in other areas too, in Indian rupees and in Russian rubles. The countries of the UK, EU, and the UK who have enslaved the people and plundered their West in the not so distant past deliver moral lectures, reflect and reveal the deep fault lines between the global North and the global South. This may not lead to a revival of a third force such as the non-aligned movement or NAM in the modern world, which seems to be progressing away from the ideologies to materialism. The global South could prefer to turn to the G20 grouping as more representative of their interests than the elitist G7. Indonesia, the world's fourth most populous country and the ASEAN grouping to which it belongs, may favor a more neutral NAM-like bloc without divisive ideological trappings. ASEAN is a stable and prosperous market that attracts global interest. For instance, it is one of China's two largest trading partners along with the US, with India also raising the level of economic engagement with it. This has brought the two Asian giants into direct competition that could turn bitter. The rivalry has become more intense following India's decision to gradually decouple its economic ties with China. It has moved beyond curbs on Chinese-produced apps entering India to apps that have any Chinese ownership, even if it is significantly lower than majority shareholdings. Beijing fears the restrictions may lead to a shift in the ASEAN market towards non-China invested apps or other allied products. Currently, the immediate epicenter of global crisis may have moved from Ukraine to Taiwan, akin to transitioning from the sublime to the ridiculous. The consequences of the nighttime landing in Taiwan of the second in line in succession to the highest position in the US has evoked bitter opposition from China. Nancy Pelosi apparently believes her visit does not contradict the one China policy upheld by the northern and southern hemispheres. Most nations are fearful of calling into question issues of sovereignty, lest it is turned against them at a future date. Pelosi may do well in Asia and its alien cultures to learn from the dexterity and quiet calm with which Australia's new Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, has carried out a delicate visit to the Pacific Islands. In the age of social media, publicity is not necessarily an ally. As for India, it will be wary of crossing any China-defined red lines raised by the Pelosi visit that will in any way be seen outside the West as a clumsy violation of the Asian way of life. In conclusion, the outcome of the war in Ukraine may have grave repercussions for both the main protagonist and those who support it, though those reverses can be corrected over time. What may cause lasting damage may be the assault on the world order that the West had shaped after the Second World War. The institutions and freedoms the West sought to promote and safeguard, commendable though they may be, from free trade to right of passage to media protection, may have suffered body blows through the haste in imposing economic and other sanctions on foes with or without UN consent. The West must realize it cannot dominate the world as before. It must learn to share power with the emerging powers, China, India, Australia, Nigeria, Iran, Brazil, Indonesia. It's an endless list. How well the old and new worlds gradually devolve power from one to another to the emerging powers will decide the future of a world trapped as it is in an existentialist environmental crisis. Australia as a middle power could in many ways be a non-threatening bridge because of its size between the global north and south, while promoting an equitable, reformed, rules-based world order to tackle environmental issues, poverty, hunger, and diseases, areas where consensus can be reached. As for India, it must continue to strive to uphold non-materialistic Gandhian values in the geopolitical shaping of a reformed, rules-based world order. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's natural inclination appears to be moving in this direction. In the Quad and the Indo-Pacific construct are a backup for India against its traditional foes in the event of reverses in the battlefield. But it realizes the unreliability of this option, given the recent history of conflicts across the world. I conclude that with this thought on those who advise India on righteousness from the perch of leadership of the free world. 2 years before the US Supreme Court's judgment in Roe versus Wade, India's Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act 1971 established women's rights to seek an abortion. Since then, one country has never weakened its embrace of the rights of women without challenge from its legislatures, its courts, or the rabble on the streets. The other has not. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. That was enormously thought-provoking. And now we're over to James Chin to talk from the ASEAN perspective. And I suspect will be similarly thought-provoking.
Thank you very much, King. Good evening to everybody. So what I'd like to do this evening is basically provide with all of you sort of the views among the foreign policy making elites in Southeast Asia. But I need to put a caveat on what I'm about to speak for the very simple reason that ASEAN collectively consists of 10 countries, and they don't have a really common view when it comes to this issue of the Quad and AUKUS. In public, they'll say one thing, but those of you who know ASEAN will know that within individual countries, the foreign policy making or the chartering crowd have many different views about what is happening around the world. What I'd like to do is basically offer you some of the widely held perceptions among the foreign policy making elite in Southeast Asia. The first point is that among this group of people, they make a clear distinction between the Quad and AUKUS. For them, when you look at the Quad, they see the Quad as something that came out of the tsunami back in 2004. That was the sort of the starting point. And then the Quad is really a group of like-minded countries coming together. It's really not a military alliances, and it can be used for things like dealing with climate change, cybersecurity. Unlike AUKUS, AUKUS is clearly a military alliance between Australia, US, and the UK. So that's the first big difference. The second big widely held view is that over the long run, many of these people believe that things like AUKUS and Quad, especially when there's talk about Quad Plus, all these over the long run will sort of diminish the idea of this thing called ASEAN centrality. As you know, right, ASEAN centrality is one of those keywords that ASEAN uses for the past 30 odd years. So this is where the real dilemma lies in Southeast Asia. This idea about the rise of China and China's growing assertiveness, they are worried about that this will lead to a real arms race between the West, led by the US, versus China, and that Southeast Asia will basically be the ground in which all these contests will take place, given that we have active contests in the South China Sea. So basically, their idea is that while all of these new institutions may be good in dealing with current crisis, providing additional platforms for people to talk about the issues, over the long run, the whole idea of ASEAN centrality will go out the window. The third point is, I think a lot of them are worried. As I know certain countries, the policy-making class are really worried about this idea of AUKUS. The first thing is that there's been no details published about AUKUS. Everything that you hear in AUKUS is basically through statements made by the ministers or key Australian officials or key US officials. But there's never been sort of a document updates on really what AUKUS is about. People talk about AUKUS being a 20 to 30-year project, and they like to project it as basically nuclear submarines to replace the current fleet using nuclear technology. But there's a nagging suspicion, given the fact that there's so much uncertainty in the security environment. In 20 or 30 years' time, Australia may find itself in a position where it really doesn't have a choice, but they may have to upgrade from nuclear power submarine to some sort of nuclear weapons. So that's the other thing that sort of worries the Southeast Asian policy-making class. And of course, there have always been, as Moses mentioned, there have always been a lot of suspicion about this sort of thing, simply because, to put it crudely, AUKUS is very much a white person's club. I mean, it is very obvious. And the other reason why they get annoyed was that because there was no hint at all. Even the closest allies to America, UK, and Australia were not told in advance that there was any planning or any hint of this was coming. So I think there is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of apprehension about it. But looking at it from the wider perspective, I think it is quite clear that ASEAN collectively, the first phase of ASEAN, as you know, was coming together to stop the spread of communism or threat from China and Vietnam. But the second phase, and we're still living through, is that ASEAN, at the end of the day, is more interested in economic issues. So while they pay lip service to security issues like AUKUS, I think at the end of the day, they'll be spending a lot of their energy and time on things like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. They'll spend a lot of time on RCEP. Basically, what ASEAN wants to do is basically to grow the economy. So that's the reason why within some ASEAN circles, they're talking about things like the Quad Plus, which is adding additional members to things. My final point is that I don't think we should get too excited about this for the simple reason that we can see that in the last 10 years, because of these big changes in the international arena, we can expect, with the rapid changes in the security architecture environment, there's a lot new players coming to the ground, and you can see there's lots of new groupings, especially smaller groupings that are popping out left and right for specific purpose. And I think it's all about this whole idea of multipolar world where you need countries to come together, starting off with very specific issues, and from there you can grow up to something maybe larger. My final 2 points is very simple, is that in the coming years, all these sort of security issues we face, things like AUKUS, all the road leads back to the intense geostrategic competition between the US and China. I mean, that is really the core issue. And secondly, at the end of the day, the policy making in Southeast Asia will just have to live with the Quad, AUKUS, and whatever is coming on the horizon. Because at the end of the day, they can't escape from the China shadow because of the geographic position of Southeast Asia. They know very clearly, even before the West came to Southeast Asia to colonize the region, they've always lived under Chinese shadow. So the attitude is that, we've lived under the West, we live under China, we can survive anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Jeff, over to you. And if you could actually address Moses' point about the potential of Australia being the bridge between the two hemispheres, that would be terrific as well.
Thank you very much. May I be permitted just a personal note to begin, because it's now something like 4 decades since Moses and I met. He is a fledgling journalist about to commence a distinguished international career, and me during my time as ABC correspondent in South Asia. So I think it's in some ways a very fine thing that geostrategic factors have raced to catch up with our relationship for the ages, Moses. So thank you for joining us. I think I should focus a little bit on AUKUS, because as one of the 2 minilateral associations we're dealing with, it in a way poses the most extreme issues, as James has indicated. And both AUKUS and the Quad in a way are children of chaos and disruption. So they have emerged as one order is disappearing, and we're in that gaseous state before a new order develops. And it poses for Australia huge complex challenges. But I don't think, since we first proposed this discussion, of course, the new Australian Labor government has come into office, and I think it's worth noting that the language of foreign policy has begun to change. So first of all, Labor has returned to a previous mantra, namely that Australia's future security lies in Asia, not from Asia. Now, from that presupposes a different emphasis in engagement in the region, in particular with Southeast Asia, I think. And so it moves away from there's a title of the book by Clinton Fernandez a few years ago. The book was called An Island Off the Coast of Australia. That's Australia, the Great Separation. Now, Foreign Minister Penny Wong has also started using the language of strategic equilibrium. That's a departure from the previous government, which was emphasising sort of like White House language about the confrontation of democracy and autocracy. Now, my sense of strategic equilibrium is that is a condition in which powers need to make some accommodation of one another. And I think that that addresses both comments by Moses and James. Another statement that Penny Wong made just before the election was that she said a future Labor government, as it was at that time, would use all means available to maximise Australia's power and influence as a middle-ranking power. Now, that also presupposes a more nuanced approach to foreign policy than we had with the former government. It's, if you like, suggesting smart strategy rather than a predominant reliance upon, the hard military and security things. So these things are interesting, and if against that background of shifting language, it brings us to consider some of the quite profound issues and questions that arise out of the AUKUS arrangement. Now, the Labor government has committed itself to continuity, support for AUKUS, but not only were our neighbours in the region not consulted or given notice about the Australian government's intention, the Labor opposition at that time was was given something like 24 hours notice of the announcement of the creation of AUKUS. And that's, in my opinion, a hell of a way to conduct foreign policy in the national interest when you're dealing with such a very substantial change in your proposed military posture. Now, it's hard to move beyond the point of understanding that a decision to propose the acquisition of nuclear submarines, especially of the type being suggested, really is a decision to project such power as we have to China rather than far beyond the continental shelf of Australia. And you can take from that the proposition also that AUKUS, including the submarine proposal, means that Australia becomes even more tightly in lockstep with the United States, something that's been happening for a long time, of course. But I think it's interesting to note the comments of two of Australia's elder statesmen. A former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, this year has written, I'll just read a brief quote, "A real issue as to whether Australia will become so much more enmeshed operationally with the United States that it will become impossible for us to resist demands that we join it in yet more wars in which it would not be at all in our own interests to engage." Back in 2016, a former Defence Minister and a former Australian ambassador to Washington, Kim Beazley, noted that the trajectory of Australia's military collaboration with the US would, quote, "challenge thinking about this nation's sovereignty." Now, I'm not proposing here either way that that enmeshment between Australia and the US is right or wrong. What I'm posing is an important question about what constitutes sovereignty and operational sovereignty in this context, and the fact that to this point, as a society, we've not really had a substantial conversation about those issues. I think we need to. Among the big risks, of course, Australia has invested and gained great benefit out of the US security alliance, and that's terrific while the US is top dog. But, you know, as we see, there are perilous fracture points in American society at the moment, increasing possibility that the American model of democracy may be degraded. And there are, of course, the possibility of further strategic missteps by the United States, as we've seen in the last decade or so. So again, the question is, coming out of that, a big issue for the government, in my view, is the question of what it may do or seek to do in order to retain sufficient agency within AUKUS as a minilateral organisation, sufficient to enable this society both to act in its own national interest when that national interest may not equate with what Washington sees as its interest. Another critical issue, there's been discussion to some extent about questions of capability and feasibility, again focusing on the proposal to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. It's a huge undertaking, not just which boats, but what sort of industrial infrastructure will be required to, if they are to be constructed or assembled in Australia, how they are to be maintained and sustained over time, what level of nuclear expertise we need to generate over decades, the challenge of crewing these submarines. They require larger crews than the current Australian fleet, and as I understand it, the Navy still finds it difficult to find enough sailors to crew the existing fleet. This is a really big issue. We've not heard really anything to illuminate the scale of those problems. And what flows from that is the question of opportunity cost. I note the comments of Duncan Lewis, who's a retired head of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation. Now, he said that the huge investment required in these nuclear submarines will necessitate the government increasing the Australian defence budget far above the present 2% of GDP, more than 2 or 3% of GDP. And he argues it makes sense that that requires a new social compact in Australia, because if you're going to spend that much of the national resources, not only on the nuclear submarines, but on the other aspects of infrastructure that are required for the security apparatus, then most probably it's going to mean that the Australian community needs to accept a lower standard of living. Big issue. And finally, and importantly, debate about what the Australian initiative may signify in terms of nuclear non-proliferation. There's a UN conference underway as we speak. The indication out of New York is that the current nuclear non-proliferation treaty is fraying at the edges under great pressure. Australian diplomats are working with the Atomic Energy Agency to shore up provisions in the treaty structure to take account of the sort of initiative that Australia is proposing. But concern remains, and debate will continue as to whether, legal or not, this creates a precedent for other nations to follow. Importantly, once a nuclear reactor goes into a military vessel, the International Atomic Energy Agency can't monitor it. So these are all issues. Again, my proposal is not to be arguing a point of view in relation to each of them, simply to say that out of AUKUS, it's one of these minilaterals, there are huge issues that we need to consider and address over coming months, years. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Moses, can I go back to you to see your responses to both James's and Jeff's comments, and then can I ask the first question as Chair's right? I'm really interested in the role of these two minilaterals and their very different births and where they come from. But what potential do they have to actually address some of the key issues? Moses mentioned the potential of climate change. I'm really interested to know whether they can actually start looking at things like climate change and the management or better management of pandemics and the responses to pandemics. So Moses, to you first.
Thank you for picking on me first. For the answer to this, I must bring in my views on Professor James and Dr. Harriet, Jeff. On climate change and environmental aspects, depletion of fish resources in the seas, various aspects, emissions. Why don't we look at an example where all disparate forces have come together in the newly forming Bay of Bengal community, where they have had successes in environmental cooperation and other such issues. Now, James suggests that the new smaller groupings may be the future. The problem with the new smaller groupings, as Australia has found out in Oceania, the Pacific Islands, is that often the smaller groupings are godfathered by a big global power. So is that the way to go? And instead, to achieve any such progress, Kim, in environment, and these are, there are contentious issues of development and curbs on emissions, which the developing world takes as curbs on industrialization, which the West has done, and the global South is falling behind on. So apart from those equity issues, we do believe that everyone is on board on climate change and various other environmental degradations, such on women's advancement, on education, on health. Everyone is on board on these things. But the way to go about it, now, I appreciate Kim's point of view, but I'm sorry, not Kim's, but Jeff's point of view. And we both have served, Jeff, Indonesia, where they have a concept of Panchshila, which is taken from the Sanskrit word and Indian philosophy of Panchshila. And I do believe that that may be an qualification on Honorable External Foreign Minister of Australia, Penny Wong's view of a strategic equilibrium. The strategic equilibrium presupposes only status quo, which obviously everyone is not satisfied with. To go further, the Panchshila ideology of Indonesia and India at one time was peaceful coexistence. So should it not be taken to that level, and then it can, and then address the seemingly schizophrenic outlook at the moment of Australia in having an AUKUS, which is demonstrably an aggressive thrust outwards, with equilibrium or peaceful coexistence.
James, to add?
Not really. The only other comment I have is that I think one of the problems with talking about the international environment now is that there's so much uncertainty. Because when we talk about the international rules-based order, again, it's sort of a rhetoric now. Because that thing went out the window when Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think at the end of the day, the outcome of the world will change many parts of the so-called rules-based order. We've seen the noise coming out of Russia. And one of the interesting things is that people here probably in Australia, we have very poor coverage of international affairs. But one of the interesting things is that the number one talking point in China now, in terms of why they're supporting Russia, is that the Chinese said that since 1990, we joined up with WTO, we follow the rules. So we're becoming an economic superpower today because we follow the rules. Now you suddenly turn around and say that the rules doesn't apply anymore. So it is, in terms of the Chinese frame, it's about hypocrisy. You have the international rules order, but that rules only stays if you're on top. The moment that I follow the rules, I have a chance to be a top dog, you turn around, and throw everything out the window. So I think we have to be very careful about how we frame what the international environment will be like, because everything is changing so rapidly. I mean, the Ukraine thing is interesting because if you go and look back at the initial stage, everybody, including all the top people in the West, they're saying that it will be a very short war because Russia had overwhelming superiority, and now people are saying that it can last for years. So who is right? Who's wrong? I mean, I don't know. I mean, the things on the ground are changing rapidly.
That's a very important point, isn't it? To note that something like the nations representing something like half the world population declined to vote in support of condemnation of Russia in the United Nations. There is a very high degree of disillusionment, skepticism about the recent history of the West, the attitude of the US-led order in terms of the global South. And a great mistake in our thinking ought to be that the West, so-called liberal order, is a light on the hill for nations of the world, because for many it isn't. As to whether Australia in this highly destabilised environment can be a bridge, as Kim posed, there's
Actually, Moses posted.
Moses posted. Sorry, my friend. That's interesting. And I heard this actually raised on on a podcast recently, somebody proposed that Australia could indeed be a bridge in that respect. And the response from from the national president of the Australian Institute of International Affairs was to say that, well, the problem with bridges is that they get trampled on by lots of people. So I think the suggestion was that there's a sharper edge to policy and national imperatives. However, we need to wait to see how the current Australian government further develops and articulates its foreign policy, given all the other stresses that it's facing at the moment. But all the indications about engagement, about, again, giving greater respect to the role of diplomacy in foreign policy, that's been very neglected in the last decade. Its approach to foreign aid budget has been markedly decreased over the past decade on trend. And the way in which it goes about reaffirming if you like, the Australian narrative as a resident member of the Indo-Pacific may take us some little way towards at least being an interlocutor between West and our other neighbours. Let's hope so.
Thank you. I think it's time to go to Q&A. So is there anyone in the room?
May I just intervene 2 quick points? May I, Kim?
Yes. Go ahead.
One is to James. James, I do appreciate all the points, but a small fact, which I believe I'm right on, that Quad in its present to this day has his most publicized activities have been naval exercises, not holding seminars on environment. This is the fact of the matter. I take your point. And the wider thing which Kim and Jeff may also want to consider is, I think we need to separate the leadership, kind of governance, the liberal values from the people themselves. And as far as I know, the people of, for instance, the big elephant in the room, the Chinese people and the Indian people are extremely cordial. I visit China often. I don't see on the streets any anger directed at me or anyone. I mean, they value the ancient civilization status that they give each other. And when I go to my village, which is remote, there are kids wanting to be Jackie Chan. I'm surprised. So this is something we need to consider. And the last point, the small point I want to make is going back all the way to 2014, when I believe President Xi made a very landmark statement. Then I think perhaps it was the Shangri-La Dialogue, in which he said, Asia for Asians, meaning an Asian century, which is very likely in many ways, maybe sharing power with the West, of course, as West is not going to go away. But Australia is advantageously placed in choosing which side it wants to be, inside Asia or outside Asia. Thank you.
So any questions in the room?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, whatever. Guy over there as well.
You go first.
Righto. Talk about mini groupings and talk about ASEAN, which is a bit of a mixed bag, as everyone realises, and talk about encroaches upon various ASEAN nations' national interests by China. And I'd like to hear probably James, but anyone to comment on what are the chances of some of the more affected parties having their own little, perhaps with external assistance from perhaps Australia, joint naval patrols or whatever the hell, joint fishery patrols, forming their own little mini grouping of like-minded ASEAN nations, not the whole lot, just a few who seem to have similar interests in resisting a certain encroachment by China.
James.
Oh. That's already happening.
That's
So
what I thought.
That's already happening. So if you look at ASEAN, right, the traditional split in ASEAN was between the 5 original founding members. and the later members who came in, including their former enemies, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. But that's already happening. So within ASEAN itself, it is widely understood that some countries are very close to China. A public expression was that back in 2012. China exerted a lot of pressure on Cambodia, and that was the first time when ASEAN could not come up with joint communique. As everybody in this room knows, right? Joint communique is just saying nice things about everybody, and they couldn't even come up with that. So I think they've learned the lesson. So the current foreign ministers meeting in Cambodia now, I'm sure they'll come up with some sort of communique. So that's already happening. That's not the problem. The problem is that from day one, China has been very careful and very clever about the way they dealt with the number one issue with ASEAN, which is South China Sea. And from day one, China has said that we will not talk to ASEAN collectively. We will only deal with China, with individual ASEAN members on the issue of the South China Sea. So from that point onwards, it was widely understood in ASEAN circles that China will not take ASEAN collectively as a single voice, and they will deal with countries bilaterally. And because of that, China is able to, how should I put it, balance and play off one country's against the other.
What about China talking to a mini grouping?
They don't have a formal mini grouping, but they do talk. It depends on how you define mini groupings. So for example, one of the ways that I define mini grouping in relation to China is you look at the way China puts out the economic carrot. So the way they've done it is that, for example, for Southeast Asia, right, one of the big carrots they're providing is this thing called the BRI. They want to build high-speed train through Peninsula Malaysia, through Thailand to Laos, and you end up in Kunming. China actually wants to push this for a very long time. So far, they've gotten basically agreement from Thailand all the way up to Kunming. It is the Malaysians that are holding them back. So they are talking about this mini grouping, but it may not be an official mini grouping, but the Chinese have always dealt with countries and they look at issues. So for example, China, most people do not know that Yunnan is very important for China because many of the tribal people in Yunnan, right, surrounding the countries of Yunnan, people like Cambodia, including northern Myanmar, Bangladesh, all these things. China has extensively with all these different cultural groups. What is not widely known in the West is that Yunnan, the universities there have actually provided extension education to all these tribal groups in those countries. So if you go to Thailand or even in Laos, people do not know that Soochow University, one of the premier Chinese university, they actually have a branch in Vientiane, and they never advertise it. So that's an example of China building long-term links. But I just want to reiterate my point that the thinking among the Southeast Asian elites is that China is always there, even before the European powers came in. We've always lived under the Chinese shadow.
It's going to be a bit more of a shadow, perhaps.
Yes, but the point is that we have survived for a few hundred years. There's no reason why we can't survive in the future.
Can I go to Greg now? Have
Yes.
you got any of the online ones, please, Greg?
Yes, there's two. The first is a question for Moses. And the question is, just for clarification, Moses, do you think India is right to join the Quad?
Beg your pardon?
Was India right to join the Quad?
Why is to join the Quad? Well, as I said in my speech, it's a backup because India, unlike most countries, unlike any country except perhaps Vietnam, which fought a limited war, India fought a full-fledged war with China with grave losses on the side. We are aware, and we actually we've come a long way. But though we are not afraid of this thing, because India is the largest, third or fourth largest standing army, naval might, all that is there. But still, it needs a plan B, a go-to in case of some backup. And that's why it is in Quad and in the greater Indo-Pacific construct as a backup, plan B. But seeing Ukraine, we are not encouraged that plan B works because I think most of them will prefer to be cheerleaders on the sidelines.
Thank you. And the other question, Greg?
Well, the other question is similar to the Ukraine and Russia. The other potential issue which slices through all of these The question is the issue of Taiwan. What is the influence of what is happening in Taiwan across all of these relationships?
Let's reverse the order. Jess, you go first.
Within Australia, there is a very active debate about the Taiwan issue. There are those, including colleagues at this university, who argue that because of the status of Taiwan as a thriving democracy, that of course we, Australia, should join with others in helping to preserve that democracy in the face of possible Chinese aggression. The other side of the debate comes from eminent thinkers. I mean, Hugh White is an eminent strategic thinker in Australia who makes, to me, a very plausible argument. If I can try to paraphrase it, I think it really sums up the dilemma. He said, we know and the Americans know that they no longer dominate the South China Sea or the oceans around Taiwan. There is no guarantee that if an armed conflict arises, that the Americans could win. Now, back in the mid-1990s, there was a crisis surrounding Taiwan. I think it followed the visit of a Taiwan leader to the US. The Chinese reacted very, very aggressively, and there was something like an 8-month-long crisis. At that time, the US was clearly dominant, and it could prevail. Now, that is no longer the case. The questions posed by Hugh White are something like this. If China does act on Taiwan, what does America do? And he argues that if America chooses not to engage, then it makes a nonsense of the US alliances with South Korea and Japan. If America chooses to engage and does not prevail, it makes a nonsense of the survival of the alliances with South Korea and Japan. If America engages, Australia could likely be a military target because of the intelligence bases we have on this territory, the presence of US forces. Who knows? If America does not prevail, ultimately it can go home. We're not going anywhere. So there are huge risks associated with the Taiwan issue if indeed it continues to develop ominously, as may well be the case. So
it's very sobering, Jeff. Do you want to add to?
Well, basically the views of the Southeast Asian elites is that Taiwan is part of China. So they're not going to, they're not going to stir the hornet's nest. The other view is that the consensus is that China is not going to do anything about Taiwan as long as none of the Taiwanese leader declares independence. So they think that this game about all these threats against America, noises from the Americans about Taiwan, all these things. All this is just noise. For them, the bottom line is when the Taiwanese declare independence, that's when they move in. Other than that, for Southeast Asia, it's purely an internal Chinese matter. But at the same time, we want to trade with Taiwan. We just want to make money.
Okay. Moses, last word from you.
I think of all the countries, India has the most stake in this. India is the only country, is eyeball to eyeball, tens of thousands of troops at great heights in snow and rain, confront each other eyeball to eyeball. So for us, it's not America, it's not any of the other countries, none of them, maybe Vietnam in a small way, but they are not taken as a threat. We do, and we have to be careful on our relationships. Will India, with a billion+ population, go to any great lengths over any Chinese disruption of Taiwan against another 1 billion plus country, both nuclear armed? Not a chance. We will accept whatever our views are on this, it's a one China policy. And I believe historically that when Taiwan was deprived of its membership of the permanent membership of the Security Council and given to China, it is historically recorded that our then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was one of the promoters of the theory that China should, and in all fairness, have that Security Council's seat. And it has not changed much since then. And as James, I fully agree with you. You're all in there, take the money and run. That's it.
I think that that's perhaps an appropriate time to wind up. Not that we're taking the money and running, but just it's an appropriate time to finish. Can I please thank you, Moses, in particular, for the challenges that you've had in joining us and how great it's been to have you. Thanks, James, wise always. Thanks, Jeff, also wise always. Thanks also to Greg and to the wonderful offsider Nigel, who made it all work. And thanks to everyone for coming, both online and in the room. It's been great. Thank you.